The day my uncle told me I was welcome to keep the family name but not the family seat, he said it with a smile polished enough for cameras. There were reporters in the room, two board observers, three outside investors. The long walnut table reflected the ceiling lights so sharply I could see the line of my jaw trembling if I looked down at the wrong angle. I was 31 years old, wearing a charcoal suit I had bought on clearance, holding a proposal I had built over 8 months, and learning in real time that blood only counts when the right people decide it does. I remember the sound first, not his voice, not mine. The soft click of fountain pens, someone setting down a water glass, the dry shuffle of folders being closed before I had even finished speaking. That was the part that stayed with me, not just rejection, in dismissal with administrative efficiency. My uncle Daniel had a talent for making humiliation sound procedural. Celeste, he said, folding his hands over a leather folder embossed with the Hale and Rowan crest. You've clearly worked hard on this, but this company is not a training ground for personal ambition. Leadership here is earned through alignment, not analysis. Across from him, my cousin Bryce leaned back in his chair and smirked as if he had already heard the line in rehearsal. My Aunt Marianne did not even look at the cost projections I had distributed. She touched one page with two fingers, as if it might stain her manicure, then slid it to the side. You'd be more valuable, she said, in a support function. Internal reporting, maybe, documentation. Something useful but appropriate. Something useful but appropriate. That was the sentence. Not you are wrong, not the plan won't work. Just a neat little verdict on what kind of woman I was allowed to be in a room they considered theirs. If you've ever sat through a conversation where people wrapped contempt in professional language and expected you to thank them for it, then you know how cold the body can feel without a single window being open. That room was over air conditioned, the Pacific fog still hanging low outside the glass, and I could still feel sweat under my collar. I gathered my proposal slowly so nobody would see my hands shake. No one offered to help. No one said they were sorry. Bryce actually laughed when one of the staple packets slipped and hit the floor. I picked it up myself, thanked them for their time, and walked out with the exact posture they had spent my whole life mistaking for softness. By the time I reached the parking garage, my face was calm again. That mattered. Because if I had cried in that elevator, if I had called anyone, if I had sent a long message about fairness or family or betrayal, they would have used that too. They would have filed it away as proof that I was emotional, unready, unstable under pressure. I knew them too well for that. So I drove home, changed out of the suit, tied my hair up, and opened a blank spreadsheet on my kitchen table. At the top, I wrote 4 words: points of operational failure. My name is Celeste Rowan. I'm 37 now, and before I tell you how I came back into that same tower 6 years later with the power to decide whether their signature division survived the quarter, and tell me where you're listening from. I always read the comments, especially the quiet ones. And if these are the kinds of stories you listen to all the way through, subscribe while you're here. It helps more than most people realize. Back then, the company was called Hale and Rowan Infrastructure Group, though nobody inside the family ever used the full name unless cameras were present. To us, it was just a firm. The offices occupied 22 floors in a downtown waterfront tower in Seattle, all steel, dark glass, and polished stone chosen to imply permanence. They specialized in municipal logistics, industrial contracting, and port link distribution systems. On paper, it was a conservative, respectable empire. In practice, it was a family machine built on proximity, inherited trust, and the assumption that no one outside the bloodline would ever understand how much of it ran on appearances. Technically, I was inside the bloodline. My father, Graham Rowan, had been the younger brother who stepped away. He had no taste for family politics, no patience for stage loyalty, and no talent for pretending incompetence was tradition when it came wrapped in the right surname. He left before I was old enough to understand why that mattered. By the time I was 12, he was running a modest freight analytics consultancy 2 counties away, and we saw the Hales mostly at weddings, funerals, and the occasional holiday dinner where everyone behaved as if old resentments were a heritage asset. Then my father died when I was 22. That sentence still looks abrupt every time I say it. One winter morning, black ice, a jackknife truck outside Ellensburg, one state trooper at the door before noon. Just like that, the one person in the family who never asked me to shrink myself was gone. My mother had passed when I was a teenager, so after that I was functionally alone in a way that makes every room feel slightly temporary for a few years. The Hales responded the way families like that often do: publicly warm, privately conditional. My uncle Daniel made a point of saying at the service that the family would always be there for me. What he meant became clearer later. There was no trust fund waiting for me, no sudden invitation into the heart of the company, no meaningful mentorship. What there was, instead, were carefully rationed opportunities tied to compliance, gratitude, and silence. I was offered a junior analyst role 3 months after graduate school, but not in strategy, which was where I had trained, not in systems design, which was what I had built my thesis around. They placed me in operations reporting, 3 floors below the executive level, in a department that spent most of its time cleaning up bad forecasting with nicer wording. I accepted because I needed the salary. That is another thing people with permanent safety nets never understand. They mistake constrained choices for agreement. They assume if you stayed, you endorsed the terms. No. Sometimes you stay because rent exists. The first year I worked there, I learned the architecture of the place, the way mechanics learned the sound of failing engines. Formally, Hale and Rowan was led by a board. Informally, it was run by Daniel's instincts, the Marianne's gatekeeping, and Bryce's loud confidence. Daniel believed relationships could override weak process. Marianne believed image could override weak judgment. Bryce believed charisma could override both. I believed numbers should match the story people were telling about them. That made me difficult very quickly. Not openly, not at first. In the beginning, I was useful. Useful enough to review root cost variance on old municipal contracts no one else wanted to touch. Useful enough to rebuild forecasting sheets when the senior manager sent out half-finished models 5 minutes before investor calls. Useful enough to sit quietly in budget reviews and notice that projected efficiency gains kept appearing in decks without corresponding changes in labor or routing behavior. When I pointed out gaps, people would nod and thank me. And then they would present the corrected version as if the correction had arrived from nowhere. That was the first lesson the company taught me. Competence is welcome in private long before it is respected in public. I rose anyway, not dramatically, not in some glittering montage of promotions and applause. I just kept doing the work people around me avoided. I documented things, built cleaner models, learned procurement patterns, studied vendor layering, asked questions before debt exposure became an emergency. Managers who found me irritating in meetings would still email me late at night with subject lines like quick thought or need a second set of eyes because they knew I would catch what they missed. By 29, and I was leading a small internal process review team unofficially, while a man 3 years younger with less experience held the official title because he golfed with Bryce. Again, none of this was dramatic inside the company. It was ordinary. That was the worst part. Not one big injustice, 1,000 small calibrations that taught you where your ceiling was supposed to be. The proposal I brought to the board that day was the first time I challenged the ceiling in daylight. It began as a side analysis after a mid-sized port coordination. Contract came in late and over budget for the third quarter in a row. Everyone blamed labor volatility. That explanation sounded clean, which is why the executives liked it. But it did not hold up once I mapped the timing. The inefficiency was not mainly labor. It was routing lag, legacy vendor overlap, the dead software layers, duplicated approvals, and outdated forecasting logic feeding decisions made by people who did not understand the system deeply enough to see where it was leaking. I built a model to prove it. Not a pretty concept deck. A real operational plan. Phased software replacement, vendor consolidation, predictive scheduling, customs timing integration, performance-linked contract restructuring. It would have been expensive up front, yes, but the 5-year savings were so obvious once I finished the model that I made the mistake of thinking the argument would win on its merits. That was my error, not the model, the assumption. I asked for 10 minutes at the quarterly strategy session. My request was approved. I thought that meant someone had read the summary. In hindsight, I guess they probably approved it because rejecting me before the room filled would have looked petty. So I stood there with the harbor behind me, the board table in front of me, and a decade of old family contempt disguised as corporate skepticism, breathing quietly through the room, while I presented the sharpest work of my career. I was halfway through the cost transition map when Bryce interrupted. "Do you know what this sounds like?" he asked, smiling at the outside observers before looking back at me. "Someone who's never had to hold a payroll trying to redesign an institution from a laptop." A couple of people laughed politely. I answered calmly. "It sounds like a plan based on performance data." Bryce shrugged. "It sounds academic." Daniel stepped in then, and not to defend me, but to soften the hit into something that could be remembered as reasonable. "Celeste has always been bright," he said. "This isn't about intelligence. It's about readiness. There are cultural things here she doesn't yet understand." Cultural things. That was bloodline language. He would never have said that to an outside executive candidate with my credentials. He said it to me because with family, they expect old obedience to do half the silencing for them. Then came Marianne with the support function line, then the closing of folders, then the elevator, then the spreadsheet on my kitchen table. I did not start with revenge. I need to be honest about that. I started with anger, yes, sharp, humiliating, chest-deep anger. But not revenge. Revenge is too clean a word for what the beginning feels like. At the beginning, it is usually grief wearing office clothes. I sat in my apartment that night with a bowl of soup I never touched, one lamp on above the sink, rain tapping the window, and I looked at the model I had built. It was still good. The room had not changed that. Their rejection had not changed that. The only thing that had changed was my understanding of what a correct answer could do inside a family-controlled system. It could lose. So I opened a second document, not the proposal, a list, where they are structurally weak. The first entries was simple. Legacy freight software with poor integration, vendor redundancy hidden inside affiliate billing, decision-making too centralized around Daniel. Bryce overexposed, underqualified, badly supervised. No meaningful independent oversight in logistics expansion. Ours by midnight, there were 23 lines. By 2 in the morning, there were 37. That was the true beginning. Not because I had some grand master plan fully formed in one night. I did not. But because I stopped viewing the company as a place that had failed to see me and started seeing it as what it actually was. A vulnerable system run by people who mistook inherited position for durable strength. The next morning, I went to work as usual. That part surprises people when I tell it. They imagine dramatic resignations or defiant speeches. No. I went in at 8:04, bad coffee in hand, badge clipped to my blazer, and finished the variance report due before noon. Marianne passed me in the hallway around 10 and said with serene cruelty, "I trust you're not taking yesterday personally." I remember answering, not at all." That was the first lie I told in service of my own future. Over the next year, I became quieter in meetings. That was deliberate. I had learned enough by then to understand that once powerful families decide you are not a threat, they stop disguising themselves. Information starts flowing in stranger ways when people underestimate the person holding the notes. Bryce talked too freely near people he considered junior. Daniel delegated explanation to whoever seemed least likely to embarrass him. Marian loved having someone precise around as long as precision stayed subordinate. So I stayed precise and subordinate outwardly. Inside, I was building a full map. At the office, my actual role expanded because no one else wanted the ugly work. Failed vendor reconciliations, port delay audits, customs exposure summaries, margin erosion analysis on municipal supply contracts. I touched nearly every broken layer of the logistics arm over the next 18 months, and because I touched it, I learned how deeply inefficient it was beneath the glossy reports. I also learned something more important. The family did not need the company to be excellent. They needed it to look stable enough to keep the right lenders calm and the right clients loyal. That difference matters. Once you understand what a system truly optimizes for, you stop taking its public language at face value. At the same time, my own life outside the office was getting smaller. I was still in the same one-bedroom apartment in Fremont, still driving a used hatchback with a passenger door that stuck in wet weather. I'm still doing contract analytics work on weekends to cover student loans and build the tiniest possible cushion. There were nights I fell asleep over spreadsheets at the kitchen table and woke up at 3 a.m. with my neck bent over cells full of root time calculations for companies that would forget my name the second the invoice cleared. But that extra work mattered because it did something Hale and Rowan never did. It paid me directly for my thinking. The first outside client was a small regional distribution outfit in Tacoma, whose owner had gotten my name through a former coworker. He did not care that I was Daniel Hale's niece. He cared that his warehouse timing was a mess, and that his carriers were charging him like he did not know it. I built him a lean reroute model over 2 weekends, flagged 3 vendor overlaps, and cut his transit waste enough that he called me a month later and said, "You saved me more than my operations manager costs." He paid on time. That matters too. Respect is nice. Prompt payment can be its own kind of emotional repair. I did more of those small side contracts. Quietly, carefully. No grand branding, no big launch. Just Celeste Rowan, consulting on invoices and a separate laptop I bought, used from a college kid in Ballard. The work taught me 2 things. First, I was good enough outside the family machine to stand on my own. Second, there were dozens of mid-sized companies carrying the same kinds of operational weaknesses I had identified at Hale and Rowan, and most of them were more open to correction because they were not trying to preserve a dynasty while pretending it was a balance sheet. And by the time I had been at the firm almost 3 years, I was effectively doing 2 jobs. Officially, I was still a senior operations analyst with no real authority. Unofficially, I was the person managers went to when vendor narratives stopped matching cost behavior. Outside of that, on nights and weekends, I had a small but growing book of consulting work tied to routing, forecasting, and procurement cleanup. Bryce, meanwhile, had been promoted twice. I want to be fair. He was not stupid. That is what made him dangerous. Truly incompetent people are easier to spot. Bryce was sharp enough to sound convincing in rooms where the numbers had already been simplified for him. He understood narrative, hierarchy, and timing. He knew when to flatter Daniel, when to let Marianne speak first, but when to frame his instincts as decisive rather than reckless. What he did not understand was systems. That gap was survivable as long as good people kept compensating for it underneath him. People like me. There was one moment, about 4 years before I left, when I think part of me still believed the family might change. Bryce had nearly walked the firm into a disastrous short-term warehousing commitment outside Long Beach after ignoring a compliance note and pushing a rushed approval because he liked the optics of expansion. I caught the exposure in a late-stage routing review by accident, traced the issue to a buried liability clause, and worked until midnight with legal and procurement to get the terms revised before signature. The next morning, Daniel called me into his office, not the boardroom, his actual office. Dark wood, reframed port photography, the smell of leather and coffee. He thanked me. Properly, too, not casually. Not in passing. He looked me in the eye and said, "You saved us from a very ugly problem." Then he added after a pause, "Bryce is still learning how to see around corners." I remember standing there thinking, here it is. Maybe this is the opening. Maybe now that the risk is visible and the contribution is undeniable, he'll finally place me where I can actually do the work at the level it deserves. Instead, he said, "I need you not to make this a larger issue. It would undermine confidence." That was when I understood the structure completely. They did not want my competence. They wanted my competence without my position. They wanted the corner seen, the fire prevented, the problem absorbed, but not the person promoted in a way that would alter the family map. I said, "Of course." Then I went back to my desk and updated the spreadsheet I kept hidden in a folder labeled Old Tax Support. I added a new section about what they protect when pressure rises. It did not say the company, it said the hierarchy. Around that same time, one of my weekend clients introduced me to a software architect named Jonah Velez. He had left a larger supply chain analytics firm after 2 restructurings and 1 bad merger. He was quiet, dry, and allergic to presentation theater. He looked at one of my forecasting models over coffee and said, "This is good, better than good, but you're thinking like someone solving problems inside a system you don't control." I asked him what the alternative was. He said, "Bah, build the system." That sentence followed me for months. It sat behind other thoughts while I rode buses to client sites or revised decks nobody would ever let me present. Build the system. Not improve theirs, build yours. I resisted it at first because it sounded too large and because large thoughts are expensive when your checking account is still fragile. Also, because leaving meant giving up the last formal thread tying me to what I had once believed was my rightful place. That thread mattered more to me than I admitted. Not because I loved the family, because some part of me still wanted the original wound corrected in the same building where it happened. But systems built on entitlement do not suddenly become fair because your work gets better. They just get more efficient at using it. The final turn began with a client I almost did not take. A small inland port services company near Tacoma called Harbor Metric needed temporary help after losing 2 analysts in 1 month. The owner could not pay my full rate. I almost declined. Then he mentioned something in passing during our first call that made me sit up in my chair. Hale and Rowan had recently outbid them on a regional consolidation contract using timeline assumptions that did not make sense. I asked him to explain. He sent over the public facing bid language, some timing summaries, and a set of general service claims. Nothing confidential, nothing improper. Just enough for me to compare the promise against what I knew from inside. The numbers were not impossible exactly, they were worse. And they were dependent on outdated internal infrastructure being treated as if it had already been upgraded. In other words, Bryce had sold future efficiency as present capability. I remember staring at the file on a Thursday night in my apartment, laptop warming my knees, rain against the glass again like it had been the night of the boardroom rejection, and feeling something inside me change from hurt into clarity. Not because I suddenly discovered they were flawed. I had known that for years. Because for the first time, I saw a path that did not require their recognition at all. If the market was already hungry for cleaner logistics intelligence, and if the family firm was surviving on reputation while lagging operationally, and then the smartest thing I could do was stop trying to rise inside their building and start building outside its shadow. Not another side hustle, not freelance forever, a real firm. Quiet at first, narrow, focused. I spent the next 6 months preparing in secret. I reduced expenses until my life felt almost aggressively simple. No vacations, no new clothes unless something actually tore. I sold a hatchback and bought a used sedan with fewer opinions. I refinanced one student loan, took every outside project I could complete without compromising my day job, built a reserve large enough to frighten me and still not feel like enough. I also started choosing people, not employees yet. That came later, but the first outlines of a serious team. Jonah, the architect, who understood systems the way surgeons understand anatomy. Mina Park, a contract data specialist I met through a warehousing cleanup project, who could turn a pile of ugly freight records into a clean narrative in 48 hours. And Reed Cormack, a former procurement manager from a coastal distributor who had seen enough bad vendor layering to become almost philosophical about it. None of them knew the full story then. Not about the family, not about the boardroom. They only knew I wanted to build something lean, rigorous, and operationally honest. That last word mattered. Honest. Because the deeper I worked inside Hale and Rowan, the more I understood that dishonesty in business rarely arrives in dramatic villain monologues. Usually it arrives as timing assumptions, deferred disclosures, soft language covering hard risk, and generations of people learning that if their name is heavy enough, reality can be negotiated a little longer. I was done negotiating with it. I turned in my resignation 9 months after the Harbor Metric realization. Daniel looked genuinely surprised when I told him. Not wounded, not panicked, just surprised in the particular way powerful men are surprised when useful structures announce they are leaving the building voluntarily. He asked where I was going. I told him I was launching an advisory firm focused on logistics optimization and procurement efficiency. Bryce, who was there because he happened to be in Daniel's office when I came in, actually laughed. On your own? He asked. I said, yes. He leaned back in the guest chair like he was watching a child announce a plan to build a jet in the garage. Celeste, consulting is one thing. Building a real firm is another. You need clients, capital, and relationships, tolerance for risk. It isn't a modeling exercise. There are lines you remember not because they are especially clever, but because time eventually improves them for you. I told him, I know. Then I stood, thanked Daniel for the opportunities I had been given, and walked out carrying one cardboard box of office things and the full internal map of their weakest division stored in memory. I did not steal a file. I did not take confidential records. I did not break a single law. What I carried out of that tower was better than any of that anyway. I carried pattern recognition, timing logic, vendor behavior, decision habits, and a deep understanding of how families who believe they own competence often fail to invest in it properly. I launched my firm 6 weeks later from a rented office above a marine insurance brokerage in Tacoma. The carpet smelled faintly like dust and copier heat. The windows were narrow, the chairs were secondhand. The internet failed twice in the first month. I had one proper conference table, two folding chairs, three serious people willing to work too hard for too little because they believed the model was real, and just enough retained business to pay everyone if nothing went wrong for 60 days. Everything went wrong, of course. Our first month billing got delayed by one client's AP department. A small customs integration job expanded without warning and nearly sank our bandwidth. Reed's landlord sold his building, so he was house hunting while renegotiating a contract bundle for us at 11 p.m. That Mina got sick the same week a warehouse audit exploded into a full route rework. Jonah slept in the office twice. I slept there once and lied to myself that it was efficient. But the work held. That was the difference. The work held. We were not promising legacy. We were solving actual failures, faster, cleaner, more truthfully than companies twice our size because we did not spend half our time protecting heirlooms. We told clients exactly what was broken. We fixed what we could. We documented what remained. We got paid for outcomes, not pedigree. 3 months in, a regional importer referred us to two others. 5 months in, we signed our first real annual services contract. 9 months in, we hired a fourth analyst and moved into a better office with a harbor view we could not really afford, but needed to believe in. The whole time, I kept hearing little fragments of Hale family news from old contacts and public announcements. Bryce had moved into a bigger role. Daniel was still expanding aggressively. Marianne was doing interviews about stewardship, discipline, and generational continuity. I never corrected any of it. I never called. I never tried to show them what I was building. That silence was not passive, it was structural. If you want people like that to understand what they misjudge, there is no point sending updates. You build something large enough that it enters their world through contracts and consequences. By the end of our second year, we were no longer a small advisory shop. We were becoming infrastructure. And back in the city, high above the harbor, the family firm was still sitting at its polished table, convinced the girl they had offered a support role had simply vanished into ordinary life. They had no idea I was building the kind of leverage that does not ask for a chair. It buys the room. And when the first real opening came, it did not arrive with drama. It arrived as a quiet line item inside a client portfolio review that made Jonah look up from his screen, look at me across the conference table, and say, "You should see this." I crossed the room, read the name at the top of the file, and felt the old tower come back to me all at once. Not the pain, the architecture, Hale and Rowan Infrastructure Group, new procurement vulnerability, external systems gap, high dependency potential. I let the page sit between my fingers for a second longer than necessary. And then I smiled for the first time that day because 6 years earlier, they had told me I was useful, but not appropriate. And now, without knowing it, they were beginning to move toward a dependence that would make that sentence very expensive. The file Jonah handed me was not dramatic. No red warning banner, no hidden confession, just a clean procurement summary from a multinational port services client we had recently signed, with one subsection marked for discussion. Secondary logistics modernization partner under consideration, Hale and Rowan Infrastructure Group. I read that line once, then again. On the next page was the part that mattered more. Mike Hale and Rowan was trying to expand its freight systems division through a bundled operational partnership tied to exactly the kind of modernization work they had dismissed when I proposed it years earlier. Only now they were not building it well internally. They were trying to bolt it on through staggered vendors, legacy integrations, and third-party dependencies they did not fully understand. In other words, they were moving into a market where my firm was already becoming difficult to ignore. Jonah watched me carefully. "You know them," he said. "Yes." He waited. I appreciated that about him. He never rushed another person's history just to satisfy curiosity. Finally, he asked, "Personal or professional problem?" "Both," I said, "but the professional one is larger." He leaned back in the chair and folded his arms. Can we outbuild them? I looked down at the summary again, at the familiar language, efficiency transformation, strategic modernization, resilient procurement chain design. So much polished phrasing wrapped around an institution that still treated operational truth like a junior employee. We don't need to outbuild them, I said. We need to understand how they're trying to grow. That became the first real shift. Up to that point, I had been building my firm toward independence. After that file, I started building towards strategic leverage, not obsession, not some secret revenge wall covered in red string and family photos, nothing childish. I was running a real company by then, not nursing a fantasy. We had clients to keep, payroll to meet, deliverables to protect. Every hour mattered, and I was far too practical to burn my future chasing a grudge. But if the market was moving in a direction where Hale and Rowan would eventually have to choose between evolving honestly or renting expertise from the outside, then I intended to be positioned on the profitable side of that decision, quietly, legally, patiently. Over the next year, we did what disciplined firms do. We specialized harder. Instead of taking every operational cleanup project that came our way, we narrowed toward exactly the areas larger legacy firms handled badly: freight forecasting integration, vendor consolidation modeling, customs linked route efficiency, and procurement risk mapping for port and industrial infrastructure clients. Not glamorous work, but sticky work. The kind that, once embedded, time becomes difficult to replace because the value sits inside systems, timing, and trust. Mina built our internal audit architecture into something sharp enough to cut through months of bad reporting in under a week. Reed turned vendor review into an art form. Jonah rebuilt our route optimization engine from the ground up and licensed the framework through a new holding structure that made our service model both scalable and harder to imitate cheaply. And I learned how to do something I had never been allowed to do inside my family's company. I learned how to decide. That may sound simple, but it changes a person in ways success alone doesn't. Inside Hale and Rowan, I had spent years being responsible without authority. Outside it, every real choice landed on my desk: which clients to decline, which risks to absorb, that which contracts needed rewritten terms, which potential hires were brilliant but unstable, which quarter we could afford a bigger office, and which one required me to delay my own pay again. There was nobody above me to plead with, impress, or blame. It was exhausting. It was also the first professional life I had ever had that felt honest. By the time we entered our third year, we were operating under a new name, Avery Meridian Systems. Jonah suggested we rebrand after our first major infrastructure client came in and said gently that Celeste Rowan Consulting sounded like a woman with a laptop and not an institution they could safely tie regional throughput to. He was right, so we built a firm with a name big enough to stand on its own and a structure lean enough not to rot from the inside. That same year, something happened that changed the scale of everything. A mid-sized logistics software firm based in Vancouver had overextended, lost two anchor clients, and quietly started shopping for strategic acquisition or licensing options. Their code base was sloppy in places but salvageable. Their client relationships were better than their internal discipline. Most important, they had built integration into exactly the kinds of back-end freight ecosystems that old family firms love to outsource badly and then pretend they controlled. I spent 2 weeks reviewing the opportunity, barely sleeping. We were not rich enough to move casually. If I got it wrong, the acquisition would eat our reserves and perhaps the company with it. If I got it right, we would stop being a service provider that recommended better systems and start owning the systems other companies quietly depended on. On the third night of review, Reed looked at me across the conference table and said, "You know, you're evaluating this like a woman deciding whether to jump across a roof." I smiled despite myself. "That encouraging? It means you think you can make it." He was right about that too. We made the move. It was structured, ugly, and stressful. Financing negotiations, bridge capital, earn-out terms, code review, client retention risk. One lender who treated me as if I was a clever graduate student asking for too much. 2 weeks where I lived on bad coffee and adrenaline. One Saturday afternoon, when I stood alone in our office kitchen staring at an acquisition draft and wondered whether I was about to destroy the healthiest thing I'd ever built by trying to make it larger, Then Monday came. We signed. Not champagne and magazine covers, just signatures, legal review, transfer schedules, and a new layer of responsibility sitting on my chest, like weight you choose, because the alternative is staying small enough to be ignored. The software changed everything. Within 12 months, Avery Meridian was no longer just diagnosing inefficiencies and proposing solutions. We were becoming embedded in them. Our forecasting engines, vendor mapping tools, and customs timing models were now being licensed, white labeled, so it are integrated into client systems through affiliate agreements that gave us visibility into where industries were moving and which firms were adapting honestly versus cosmetically. That distinction mattered more than most people understood. Cosmetic adaptation is what legacy firms do when the market starts punishing their habits, but they still believe image can buy them another few quarters. New decks, external consultants, reorganized labels, fancy language around divisions that still leak money through old pipes. Honest adaptation hurts more at first. It requires admitting what no longer works. My family had never been built for that kind of honesty. I knew it before I saw proof. Then the proof started arriving anyway, not through spies, not through anything illegal or dramatic, through business. Avery Meridian began picking up subcontract work linked to larger modernization packages. And once you sit close enough to enough infrastructure files, patterns start surfacing. Hale and Rowan kept appearing on the edges of the same categories. Delayed vendor cleanups, overstated implementation timelines, redundant procurement relationships treated as strategic flexibility. The language changed, the weakness didn't. One afternoon, almost 4 years after I left the tower, Mina came into my office carrying a tablet and said, "I think your old company is trying to scale a division it doesn't fully control." I took the tablet and read the summary, then the attached support notes, then the timing assumptions. It was Bryce all over it. Not his name directly, but his fingerprints. Aggressive optics, underestimated integration costs, was overconfident timeline compression, revenue forecast built on smooth execution through departments that historically did not execute smoothly without someone like me behind the scenes compensating for them. I asked, can we map how dependent they are becoming on external support? Mina's mouth tightened a little, which was the closest she came to looking amused. Already started. That was the beginning of the second shift. The first shift had been building a firm. The second was recognizing that my family's company was drifting toward a kind of dependency it would not understand until it was too late. I want to be careful with how I say that, because dependency in business is not always dramatic. Sometimes it arrives dressed as convenience, a vendor that quietly becomes indispensable, a software layer nobody in house fully knows how to replace, a data model that starts as a pilot and ends up shaping 40% of decision making because the people using it no longer trust their own older systems. That kind of dependency does not happen overnight. It accumulates through impatience. And Hale and Rowan had always been impatient in exactly the wrong places. They wanted the appearance of modernization without the humility of internal reform. So they outsourced pieces, then more pieces, then adjacent pieces, then they built narratives around those outsourced improvements as if the improvements reflected their own sophistication rather than someone else's work. I knew that language intimately because I had once been one of the invisible people doing the work they later spoke over. At some point in our fifth year, Avery Meridian entered a strategic partnership with a global transport consortium called Kessler Vale. The name matters only because they were large enough, old enough, and well connected enough to turn our quiet growth into something no longer deniable. We did not get there by flattering them. We got there because a prior client had watched us clean up a staggered port coordination mess in under 8 weeks and told their chief operating officer, "These people don't market like sharks, but they fix what your expensive consultants keep renaming." That line still makes me smile. The Kessler Vale partnership tripled our reach. Not instantly in cash, though the revenue jump was real. More in access, better clients, larger systems, broader visibility. We started seeing whole regional supply webs instead of isolated corporate pain points. And we moved from one floor of problems to the building blueprint. And somewhere inside that larger view, Hale and Rowan kept getting smaller. That may sound cruel. It wasn't. It was clarifying. From inside the family machine, they had once seemed huge enough to determine what someone like me could become. From the vantage point of real scale, they were what many legacy firms eventually are: polished, respectable, overconfident, and far more fragile than they understood. By then, Daniel had started appearing in trade publications talking about next generation adaptation. Bryce was quoted often on innovation panels, which would have been funny if he had not sounded so certain. Marianne chaired some foundation initiative about female leadership and regional growth, a fact that was almost artistically offensive given the support role line she had handed me years earlier. I watched all of it without responding. That was important. Silence, when chosen correctly, is not weakness. It is information control. Meanwhile, Avery Meridian kept expanding. We opened a second office, then a third. We hired analysts who were better than I had been at their age because I wanted a company where talent was not treated like a threat to inherited order. We built internal review systems designed to catch exactly the kinds of forecasting distortions I had watched get softened or buried inside my family's firm. We paid people properly. We gave credit in public. We did not use loyalty language to disguise extraction. It was not perfect. No company is. I made mistakes. It hired one senior director too quickly and had to unwind the damage 6 months later. Missed a market timing shift in one region and overcommitted on a lease. Trusted one client's temporary delay explanation longer than I should have. There were quarters where cash management kept me awake until 3 a.m., and quarters where growth outran my emotional ability to process it. But the structure held because the structure told the truth. That is not a small thing. Around the same time, I started hearing more directly from people who had worked at Hale and Rowan and left. Not because I sought them out. People move through industries. They call old contacts. They compare notes over coffee. They mention things. A former regional manager told Reed that Bryce had become dangerously married to presentation logic. One procurement contact told Mina that Hale and Rowan's modernization arm was all dashboard, no spine. Someone else mentioned unusually high turnover in the very division where I had once proposed building actual predictive infrastructure. I did not gloat. I listened. There is a difference. One night, after most of the office had gone home, Jonah knocked on the glass wall of my office with 2 fingers and stepped in carrying a printout. "I've been tracing integration dependencies on a portfolio review," he said. "You need to see how this lands." He placed the printout on my desk. At first glance, it looked like any other systems map. Vendor layers, data dependencies, software pathways, license arrangements, distribution nodes. And then I saw the highlighted line: Hale and Rowan, estimated indirect reliance on Avery linked systems or licensed affiliate tools, 31% and rising. I sat back slowly. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "How indirect?" "Indirect enough that they likely don't understand the full exposure. Direct enough that if several relationships consolidated under one decision point, it would get their board's attention quickly." I looked at the map for a long time. Not because I was shocked, because I recognized the shape of inevitability. This is the thing about arrogance in institutional families. It makes them lazy in very specific ways. They think pedigree is a strategic asset. Sometimes it is, for a while. But it can also become a blindfold. You stop asking who built the things keeping you competitive because you assume the answer must somehow already belong to you. Avery Meridian did not technically control them at that stage. That would be too simple and too theatrical. What we had instead was something more realistic and much more powerful. Influence through infrastructure. If the right partnerships converge, if the right contracts were signed, if the right dependencies deepen. I remember getting up from my desk, walking to the window, and looking down at the harbor lights while Jonah waited. After a while, he said, "You're thinking dangerously." "Strategically," I corrected. He smiled. "That's usually how it starts." I turned back to him. "What would it take to become essential instead of adjacent?" He did not answer immediately. He sat down across from me and started listing possibilities: selective acquisitions, deeper licensing agreements, send back-end integration ownership, managed service bundling through partner fronts, data architecture consolidation, where our models became the cheaper, cleaner default. As he talked, I could feel the outline of the next 6 years start to take shape, not as revenge, as positioning. That is a distinction I need to keep making because anger alone would never have carried what came after. Anger burns hot and stupid if you let it lead. Strategy is colder. Strategy can wait through quarters, audits, rebrands, negotiations, and boring Tuesday afternoons. Strategy can sit through family weddings without blinking. Strategy can watch the people who once laughed at you praise their own instincts while walking deeper into structural reliance on something your name quietly owns. So that became the plan. We would not go after Hale and Rowan directly, as we would become indispensable to the ecosystem they were too proud to examine closely. Over the next 18 months, Avery Meridian made three moves that looked unrelated unless you knew what to look for. First, we acquired a controlling interest in a mid-tier customs automation provider whose tools were quietly being adopted by several regional industrial carriers Hale and Rowan already depended on. Second, we entered a white label analytics agreement through a partner entity that serviced procurement dashboards for two firms on Hale and Rowan's expansion shortlist. Third, we licensed a route optimization layer through a holding structure Kessler Vale preferred for bundled modernization packages. None of this was secret. It was simply invisible to anyone who thought bloodline mattered more than systems ownership. I did not hide my name illegally. I structured business the way sophisticated firms do every day: parent entities, holding companies, managed service agreements, licensing layers, clean legal work, boring paperwork with enormous consequences. By year 6, if someone had laid the dependency map flat on a boardroom table, my uncle would have understood the danger instantly, but nobody laid it out for him. Not yet. And because nobody did, the family kept doing what old family companies do when times appear good. They kept congratulating themselves for momentum they did not fully understand. Bryce gave one interview where he talked about our proprietary modernization edge in language so close to what I had once said in that boardroom that I had to stop the video halfway through and laugh into my coffee. The Marianne was photographed at a charity gala beside a caption about legacy leadership in dynamic times. Daniel accepted an industry award and thanked the next generation for proving the family still knew how to choose wisely. I watched none of it in real time. Reed sent screenshots when he thought I would appreciate the irony. Sometimes I did. Mostly I stayed busy, building the thing that would matter more than irony when the time came. Then Kessler Vale approached us with a proposal neither of us had expected so soon. They wanted to formalize Avery Meridian into a larger international operating structure under a new strategic umbrella. More capital, more reach, more institutional weight. It would not erase my control, but it would place the company inside a global framework large enough to shift how legacy firms treated us. And for 3 days, I said no in my head before I ever said yes aloud. Because scale always costs something. And because some part of me still loved the fact that Avery Meridian had been built from a cramped office, 4 people, and a refusal to disappear. But nostalgia is not strategy either. I took the deal. Not all at once, not blindly. There were terms, governance requirements, equity protections, operational carve-outs. I fought for them all. When it was done, Avery Meridian became the core systems division inside a larger international group operating under the name Vare Capital Logistics. Suddenly, we were not the sharp little firm doing excellent work in important corners. We were a major industry force with the reach to influence which regional firms survived modernization and which ones became cautionary case studies. And that was when Hale and Rowan finally started moving toward us in a way they could not control. At first, it was indirect: RFP pathways, consortium linked reviews, procurement prequalification, then broader contract discussions attached to bundled logistics transformation programs. Then finally, the sentence I had spent years positioning to hear: potential anchor partnership candidate, Hale and Rowan Infrastructure Group. I read that line in a conference room overlooking the Thames during a portfolio review while 3 executives discussed revenue models around me. No one in that room knew what the name meant to me. That made it easier. I kept my face still and asked the questions anyone in my position would ask. What's their current exposure profile? Who owns implementation on their side? How dependent would they become if we onboarded the full package? The answers came back in clipped executive language: moderately exposed, leadership concentrated, high dependency if end to end systems adopted. I made notes in the margin and said, proceed with due diligence. That was all. Just 4 words. No lightning, no music, no revenge monologue floating through my head. But when the meeting ended and I stepped into the glass hallway alone, I put one hand against the cool wall for a second and let myself feel the old boardroom in Seattle rise up around me. Support function. Something useful but appropriate. Not Merrick material. No, not Merrick. That was another family, another story. My mind corrected itself instantly. Not Hale and Rowan material. I's not fit for the table, not aligned with leadership. 6 years later, my signature was entering the preliminary architecture of a contract that could place their most protected division under systems my company controlled. Not because I forced the market, because I understood it before they did. That night, I called Jonah from my hotel room. He answered on the second ring. How far did it go? Far enough, I said. He was quiet for a moment, then, are you sure you want to do this? I looked out over the river and the city lights beyond it. No, I said honestly, I'm sure I want the option. That distinction mattered, because options are where power really lives, not in striking, in being able to decide. By the time I flew back to Seattle, the due diligence packet was already moving through the right channels. Publicly, but it was just another major contract pathway in a market shifting toward integrated logistics modernization. Privately, it was the first moment the family tower and the company I had built were beginning to move into the same orbit again. They still did not know. To Hale and Rowan, their capital logistics was just another giant global structure with strong numbers and sharper systems than most. One more large force in a world they assumed they could navigate through relationships, confidence, and whatever remained of the Hale name. They had no idea that buried inside that structure, not hidden, but simply unannounced, was me. And if the partnership deepened the way I suspected it would, then one day soon I would walk back into the same glass tower where I had once gathered my fallen paper off the floor, not to ask for recognition, and not to explain the past, not to tell them what they had done to me, just to sit at the front of the room and let the numbers do what my voice had never been allowed to do there before. But before that day came, something else had to happen. Because power is one thing, timing is another. And a week after I came back from London, Mina walked into my office with a look on her face I knew too well by then. Calm, focused, almost too calm. What is it? I asked. She placed a thin folder on my desk. Bryce Hale, she said. I think he's not just overconfident. I looked at the folder. What do you mean? Mina met my eyes. I think he's moving losses where he thinks no one will look. That was the moment the story stopped being about a contract and became about a reckoning. I did not open Mina's folder right away. That probably sounds strange. But there are moments when instinct tells you the paper in front of you is going to change the shape of the next few years, and some part of you wants one more minute before the future becomes specific. My office was quiet except for the low hum of the vent and the faint clatter of someone dropping a metal spoon in the break room down the hall. Rain streaked the windows. Seattle had gone gray by 3 in the afternoon. The harbor flattened into one long sheet of dull steel, and Mina was still standing there with both hands lightly clasped in front of her, waiting. Finally, I flipped the folder open. Inside were 7 pages of summary notes, 3 flagged financial extracts, and a spreadsheet printout with color-coded irregularities that looked innocuous if you did not know what you were reading. I knew exactly what I was reading. Undeferred liabilities parked in temporary operating categories. Revenue recognition timing shifted between quarters in ways that made volatility look like growth. Vendor credits flowing through affiliate accounts with just enough layering to create plausible confusion later. Nothing theatrical. No cartoon villain trail of obvious theft. Much worse than that. Intelligent manipulation hidden inside complexity. I read the first page once, then again. When did you start seeing it? I asked. 3 weeks ago, Mina said. I wanted to be sure it was a pattern and not just bad reporting discipline. And now, she pulled out the chair across from my desk and sat down without waiting to be asked, which told me how serious she thought it was. Now I think it's deliberate. I leaned back and let the folder rest open on the desk between us. Walk me through it. She did, not dramatically. Mina never dramatized anything. She moved point by point, the way surgeons probably explain something terrible once they have already accepted it as a true. Hale and Rowan had been using a series of small affiliated entities, vendor timing shifts, and internal category transfers to smooth over underperformance inside the logistics modernization arm. Most of the individual moves were explainable in isolation. That was the whole trick. One delayed recognition here, one temporary allocation there, one unusually generous assumption on receivables, one quarter where losses disappeared into a cost pool labeled implementation transition. None of it screamed fraud when viewed alone, but the pattern did. As the pattern said, someone at the top understood exactly how much weakness the board and outside observers could absorb before confidence cracked. And the person driving most of the numbers attached to those decisions, at least according to sign off chains and leadership oversight, was Bryce. I asked the obvious question: how close are we to certainty? Mina tapped the stack lightly with one finger. Close enough for caution, not close enough for accusation. That distinction mattered. I have seen too many people destroy their own advantage by moving too early just because the first shape of the truth felt satisfying. Timing is not a side issue in stories like this. Timing is the spine. Who else knows? I asked. Just Jonah and Reed. In broad terms, nobody else. Good. But I closed the folder and sat there for a while, thinking about a man who had spent half his career using certainty as a costume. Bryce had always liked rooms where people could not easily challenge his version of events. Investor presentations, board summaries, camera-ready panels. He liked executive language because it let him sound like gravity instead of pressure. And now, if Mina was right, that costume was holding together more of the family empire than even Daniel probably understood. I looked up at her. No speculation outside this room, I said. No theory language and email. Build me a clean internal review path and separate every inference from every documented fact. She nodded once, already started. Of course she had, after she left. I locked the folder in the left drawer of my desk and stood by the window for a long time with my hands in my pockets, watching a ferry move through the gray water like it had all the time in the world. It is one thing to imagine facing down the people who once humiliated you. It is another to realize the moment may arrive through their own structural collapse rather than your design. That realization did not feel triumphant. It felt precise. Over the next month, we treated Hale and Rowan the way we would have treated any sensitive exposure case tied to a potential anchor partnership. Cautiously, legally, quietly. I built a separate review cell inside the firm with only 4 people aware of the full scope. Me, Jonah, Mina, and our outside forensic counsel. A woman named Lila Mercer, who had once spent 11 years in white-collar regulatory investigations before leaving to run her own practice. Lila had the kind of face that made dishonest people explain themselves twice. She came into our office on a Thursday afternoon carrying a raincoat and a slim briefcase, sat down in the conference room, read Mina's summary in total silence, and then said, "You have enough here to become dangerous if you lose discipline." I appreciated her immediately. "That's why you're here," I said. She looked at me over the top of the file. "Do you want the truth or do you want the theater?" "The truth." "Good," she said, "because if this is what it appears to be, the theater will arrive on its own." That line stayed with me. Lila's first instruction was simple. No emotional language anywhere. And not in internal notes, not in email, not in conversation summaries. We were not tracking betrayal. We were tracking material risk, potential misrepresentation, and board-level exposure connected to a possible strategic partnership. That framing protected us legally and, just as important, protected me psychologically. It kept the old family wound from becoming the center of the work. The second instruction was even more important: do nothing that could be interpreted as manufacturing proximity. If Hale and Rowan moved toward us through existing business channels, fine. If the contract opportunity deepened naturally, fine. But we were not to go hunting through side doors, social contacts, or old emotional access points. The minute this looked personal in execution, even if the facts were sound, the facts would have to fight harder to be believed. So we waited. And while we waited, the business side kept moving. The due diligence process with Veyer continued in exactly the boring, high-stakes way large contracts usually do. Procurement reviews, systems compatibility checks, forecasting stress test, governance questionnaires, regional implementation models. There were days when I spent 8 hours discussing tiered licensing structures and data transfer liability with executives in 3 time zones, while the folder in my drawer quietly reminded me that the family firm on the other side of this possible relationship might already be balancing itself on fiction. That contrast did something to me. It made the old pain feel smaller and the stakes feel larger, because by then, this wasn't about proving I belonged in a boardroom anymore. Second, I had my own boardrooms, my own executives, my own legal teams, my own decisions, with 7 figure consequences attached to them. Whatever was left of the original hurt had become sediment. The live thing now was responsibility. If Hale and Rowan became more deeply tied to Vare's infrastructure, while Bryce was concealing losses and managing perception instead of reality, then this wasn't a family story anymore. It was a governance problem. That is when my emotional center shifted fully from survival to control. I can tell you the exact moment. It was a Tuesday, 6:48 p.m., dark already outside, most of the floor half empty. Jonah came into my office with a revised dependency map and set it on my desk without speaking. I looked at the chart, followed the highlighted layers, and saw the path clearly for the first time. That if the anchor partnership went through under the structure currently proposed, Hale and Rowan's logistics arm would become reliant within 2 quarters on systems, pricing channels, and support architecture ultimately governed through Vare entities I controlled operationally, not symbolically, actually. I sat back slowly. Jonah said, "You could walk into that tower and decide whether their quarter survives." There it was, plain, cold, true. Not because I had manipulated the market into absurdity, because I had built something competent enough, large enough, and strategically placed enough that their weakness was naturally drifting toward my strength. I looked at the map a long time, then I said no. He frowned. No? No quarter by quarter hostage logic, I said. If we touch them, it will be through governance and structure, not theatrics. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. That wasn't what I meant. I know. But I needed to hear myself say it aloud. Because power changes people fastest when it first becomes personal. The moment you realize you could make someone kneel is exactly the moment you have to decide what kind of person you are when no one can stop you. What I wanted, if I was honest, was not to make Bryce kneel. I wanted a room full of witnesses and numbers so clean no one could hide inside family language ever again. Meanwhile, the family kept performing stability. Trade publications quoted Daniel on disciplined growth. Bryce spoke at a regional infrastructure summit about resilience through modernization. Marion hosted a donor dinner under a banner about women leading with courage and tradition. I saw the photos because Reed sent them to our group chat with captions so dry they made Mina choke on her coffee once. I never responded. Not because I was above it, because distance was part of the discipline. A few weeks later, Lila sent me an email with the subject line update. Internal concern elevated. Inside was a short note asking for a private call. We spoke that evening at 8:06 p.m. "I've reviewed another batch of public-facing support materials against the inferred financial pattern," she said. "Still not enough for direct allegation. More than enough to justify enhanced caution if Vare proceeds." What changed? "Bryce's leadership summaries are too smooth," she said. "While his risk language doesn't match what someone in his position should be seeing if the underlying categories are as unstable as they appear. That sounds minor to people who don't work around executive risk. It isn't. Tone can be evidence when tone consistently evades the kinds of uncertainty good operators naturally disclose." "Could Daniel not know?" I asked. Leela was quiet for a moment. "Possibly," she said. "But I wouldn't rely on that possibility. Neither would I. I had known my uncle too long. Daniel never liked details, but he had a predator's instinct for danger around money. If he did not know the full shape of what Bryce was doing, he almost certainly knew enough to feel the edges of it and had decided not to pull too hard, which meant the hierarchy had once again been protected over the truth. And some patterns survive every market shift. The following Monday, Vare's procurement chief requested an in-person strategic review in Seattle to finalize the structure of 3 major partnership candidates, one of which was Hale and Rowan. I remember reading the email in the kitchen at home, standing barefoot on cold tile, tea going lukewarm in my hand, while early sunlight hit the counter in thin bars through the blinds. There are messages that feel like weather changing. That was one of them. The meeting was scheduled for 6 weeks later, long enough to prepare, short enough to feel physical. When I arrived at the office that morning, I called Jonah, Mina, Reed, and Leela into the conference room and shut the door. No assumptions, I said before anyone sat down. No celebratory mood. We prepare for this the way we would prepare for any exposure case attached to a major strategic decision. Reed sat first, loosened his tie, and said, "You're talking like a woman holding a loaded file." "I'm talking like a woman who intends to still be standing after the room reacts," I said. That shut him up in the best possible way. Over the next 6 weeks, we built two structures at once. The public one was the VAER strategic review package, contract value scenarios, dependency risk metrics, transition options, governance recommendations, performance summaries, neutral, rigorous, professional. Exactly what a major global group would expect before deepening ties with any regional infrastructure firm. The private one was contingency architecture. What if Hale and Rowan's exposure sharpened before the meeting? What if Bryce tried to accelerate the partnership to cover instability? What if Daniel attempted to isolate the conversation socially once my role became visible? What if they offered private reconciliation instead of structural accountability? What if they denied everything and forced an external escalation path? Lila made us rehearse the logic as if we were preparing for litigation, which in some ways we were, not because I expected a courtroom, because truth around powerful families often travels through threat before it reaches daylight. Those 6 weeks also changed me in smaller, stranger ways. I found myself remembering details from the old office with ridiculous clarity. The texture of the boardroom chairs, the smell of Daniel's office in winter. It's the way Bryce used to tap a Mont Blanc pen against a folder when he wanted to look patient while someone else spoke. None of those memories carried the same power anymore, but they came back anyway, like my nervous system wanted to inventory the terrain one more time before re-entry. One night, around 11 o'clock, I was still at the office alone reviewing the final meeting packet when I opened the bottom drawer of a side cabinet and found something I had forgotten was there. The original board proposal, not the whole thing. Just the executive summary and cost map from 6 years earlier, folded once and marked with my own handwritten revisions in the margins. I must have tucked it into a binder during one of our office moves. For a second, I simply stood there holding it, the paper softened by time, my own younger handwriting looking both familiar and unbearably earnest. I took it back to my desk and read the opening paragraph. The model was still sound, not every detail. Markets had shifted, technology had moved, but the core logic held. Predictive freight integration, vendor consolidation, transparency and timing assumptions, layered modernization, done honestly instead of cosmetically. I sat there with the old summary in my hand and realized that part of my calm now came from something I had not fully named before. They had not rejected a foolish girl. They had rejected a correct answer from the wrong mouth. That matters. It changes the emotional geometry of memory. It moves shame back to its proper address. The Seattle review meeting was set for a Thursday morning at 9:30 in the Hale and Rowan Tower itself. Neutral ground on paper. Not neutral to me. VAER's procurement chief assumed using the candidate firm's board facilities would allow for better access to senior leadership, systems demonstrations, and regional implementation discussion. Reasonable, efficient, entirely normal. Only 3 people inside VAER knew the full internal truth of what the meeting meant to me. The procurement chief was not one of them. Neither was the general counsel. They knew I would be leading the review because I ran the operational architecture behind the partnership framework and because by then people listened when I said I needed to be in the room. That was enough. A week before the meeting, Lila came into my office with the final internal memo. She handed it over and said, "You now have 2 separate issues. Do not confuse them in the room." I knew what she meant, but I asked anyway. Say it. The first issue is whether Hale and Rowan qualifies for deeper strategic integration. The second is whether internal leadership there has created exposure that may make integration unsafe. One is a business decision. The other is a governance event. If you merge them emotionally, you weaken both. I nodded. And if they recognize me and try to shift it into family language, they will, she said, return every sentence to structure. She stood, gathered her coat, and then paused by the door. One more thing. What? When the room changes, let it change slowly. Don't rescue anyone from understanding. That line followed me all the way to Thursday. I arrived in downtown Seattle 12 minutes early, not because I needed the time operationally, because I wanted the time physically. The tower looked exactly as I remembered and smaller than I remembered, which is its own kind of victory. Same dark glass, same polished stone lobby, same reception desk positioned to make visitors feel watched before they felt welcomed. I wore a navy suit tailored so sharply it made my shoulders feel steadier than they were. A cream silk blouse, low black heels, and a slim white shreed once told me made me look like I issued bad news for a living. My hair was pinned back cleanly. My tablet held 3 versions of the presentation package. My bag contained the strategic review materials, governance contingencies, and in a separate inner sleeve, the old executive summary from 6 years earlier, not as a prop, as a reminder. The receptionist looked up when I stepped forward, smiled professionally, and then glanced at the guest list on her screen and lost the smile for half a second. That told me my full name had registered. Good morning, I said. She recovered quickly. Good morning. You're here with Ver Capital Logistics. Yes. She printed the badge and slid it over. They're expecting you on 22. Of course they were. Same floor. When I reached the elevator bank, I caught my reflection in the mirrored panel beside the doors. Calm face, straight spine, controlled breathing. Not the young woman from before, even though some animal part of my body still recognized the building as a site of old injury. The elevator opened with a soft chime. Inside, the steel walls reflected me back from 3 angles. I pressed 22. As the doors closed, I felt the smallest flicker of nerves under my ribs. And not because I feared them anymore, but because the body does not always distinguish between danger and memory in the moment before impact. When the elevator opened again, the old floor was waiting. Walnut trim, frosted glass, harbor visible through the long corridor windows, staff moving in low voice patterns calibrated to executive presence. The carpet was new, the atmosphere was the same. At the far end, outside the boardroom doors, stood Bryce. He was speaking to someone from finance. One hand in his pocket, the other holding a folder, still handsome in the expensive, overconfident way certain men age when nobody has yet made them pay for enough. He looked up as I approached. At first, he did not recognize me. I could see the exact second it changed. His eyes moved from the Ver badge clipped to my lapel to my face and stayed there half a beat too long. The folder lowered slightly in his hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, but the smile arrived a fraction too late. Celeste. Just my name, no warmth, no surprise theatrics. He was too practiced for that. I answered, Bryce. The finance director beside him glanced between us, picked up enough tension to excuse himself immediately, and disappeared through the side door. Bryce recovered first, of course. Men like him always try to recover first. Well, he said lightly, this is unexpected. Not really, I said. His eyes flicked once to the badge again. Ver. He was doing the math quickly now, trying to place rank, access, danger. Bahar, I didn't realize you were involved on the review side. That's why I'm here. A tiny silence opened between us. Not awkward, informative. Then he smiled again, thinner this time. Daniel will be interested to see you. I held his gaze. I imagine so. He pushed the boardroom door open and gestured for me to enter ahead of him, like manners could soften what was about to happen. Inside, the room was almost exactly the same. Long walnut table, floor-to-ceiling glass, harbor gray beyond it, water set at each chair, printed packets aligned with the kind of symmetry assistants create when leadership mistakes order for control. Daniel sat near the head, silver-haired now, face more lined, but posture unchanged. Marianne was to his right, still immaculate, still arranged like someone who considered visual discipline a moral quality. 3 independent directors, 2 outside advisors, Ver's procurement chief, and general counsel on the opposite side. 1 strategy analyst from our side already logged into the display system. When I stepped in, Daniel looked up. He recognized me immediately. Unlike Bryce, he did not let the reaction show all at once. It moved through him in smaller shifts, eyes narrowing, jaw setting, shoulders adjusting as if the air in the room had changed density. Marianne's hand, resting beside her pen, went still. No one else understood yet. That part came a second later when Vere's procurement chief stood and said, "Good, Celeste is here. We can begin once she's set up. She'll be leading the systems and governance review." There are silences that feel empty. This one didn't. This one felt like a structure taking weight. I placed my tablet on the table, connected to the display, and looked briefly at the room that had once dismissed me as useful but inappropriate. Then I took my seat at the front. Not the side chair, not the support position, the front. And for the first time in that building, no one asked me to move. No one asked me to move. But the room had already started reorganizing itself around what my presence meant. You can feel that when it happens. Not emotionally, structurally. People sit a little straighter. Nobody reaches for water even if they were about to. The person who usually opens with easy confidence starts checking the edges of the agenda in their mind. What looked like a routine review 10 seconds ago becomes something else. And everyone with real instincts in the room knows it before the first slide appears. But Vere's procurement chief, Alan Pierce, did not know the family history. He only knew I was leading the review because the underlying infrastructure architecture, dependency analysis, and governance scenarios all ran through divisions I oversaw. He smiled at the room the way executives do when they think a difficult meeting is still merely technical. "Thank you all for making the time," he said. "Today is intended to finalize our assessment of strategic compatibility, transition risk, and oversight requirements tied to a possible expansion of partnership between Hale and Rowan and Vare Capital Logistics." Daniel nodded once. Composed now in the way older powerful men become composed when instinct tells them losing visible control will cost more than speaking too soon. Marianne had not looked away from me. Bryce took his seat halfway down the table and opened a leather folder with exaggerated calm. I noticed, absurdly, that he still used the same expensive pen brand he had tapped against the boardroom table 6 years earlier. I connected the tablet, glanced once at the opening screen, and began. "Good morning," I said. "I'll keep this focused. We'll start with systems integration exposure, move to performance dependency, then governance suitability under deeper strategic alignment. Simple, neutral, professional, no family language." That was deliberate. The first 10 minutes were almost boring, which is exactly how I wanted them. System pathways, service architecture, implementation dependencies, weighted exposure ranges if Vare systems became embedded across Hale and Rowan's logistics arm beyond current contracted scope. I spoke evenly, neither cold nor friendly, and let the numbers establish the air before anything more dangerous entered it. Bryce tried once to interrupt on terminology. I let him finish and then said, "The definition I'm using is the one from your own transition packet, page 16. That shut him up for a while. Alan asked a question about timing assumptions. I answered. One of the independent directors leaned in when I brought up dependency concentration by service layer. Marianne made 2 notes and underlined something hard enough to leave an impression on the page beneath it. Daniel kept his hands folded in front of him, listening with the stillness of a man who had already realized this meeting would not proceed according to whatever private script he had imagined once he saw me walk in. By slide 11, when the room understood the first important thing. Hale and Rowan was not evaluating Vare from a position of equal strength. They were already more reliant than they appeared. Not fatally, not theatrically, but materially. Their logistics arm had grown used to performance improvements tied to systems, pricing channels, and optimization layers that touched Vare adjacent infrastructure more deeply than most of their own public-facing language acknowledged. If the partnership deepened, that reliance would increase fast. I paused on the slide showing indirect dependency bands, a set of blue and gray bars stretched across the screen. Clean design, no drama, just reality arranged legibly. As of current modeling, I said, if full conversion proceeds under the draft scope, Hale and Rowan's logistics division would move from moderate reliance to high strategic dependency within 2 quarters, particularly across forecasting, route optimization, vendor analytics, and customs-linked timing architecture. One of the outside advisors said high dependency by whose definition? Mine, I said first, then added, and theirs. The written threshold is included in your packet, Appendix 3. A few people turn pages. That kind of moment matters, not because it's flashy, because it reminds the room who came prepared. Bryce finally spoke again. With respect, this sounds like a very elaborate way of telling us a strong client-vendor relationship creates operational trust. His tone was smooth, almost amused. He was trying to restore narrative scale, make the thing smaller, and bring it back inside language he could dominate. I looked at him for 1 second longer than necessary. No, I said, operational trust is optional. Structural dependence is not. That landed, not loudly, but you could feel it. Alan glanced at me, then at the board, and shifted his chair slightly as if he had just realized the review had moved out of ordinary procurement territory. Daniel spoke for the first time. Celeste, he said, the name measured. Before we go further, perhaps it would be useful to disclose the extent of your prior familiarity with this company. There it was. Not accusation, not welcome. A bid to frame me before I framed the room. I answered at once. My prior familiarity is not relevant to the dependency math. But since you've asked, yes, I worked here for several years early in my career. A flicker moved through the board. One of the independent directors turned to Daniel with a look that wasn't suspicion yet, but had moved past comfort. Alan frowned slightly. I wasn't aware of that. No reason you would be, I said. It doesn't affect the analysis. That was true. And because it was true, saying it calmly gave me more ground than defensiveness ever could have. Marianne finally spoke. How interesting, she said. And yet you didn't think to mention that before leading a review of our company. Her voice was controlled, elegant, almost soft. She had always preferred polished knives. I met her eyes. I didn't think the fact that I once worked in a junior capacity here outweighed 6 years of building the systems architecture this review concerns. That silence afterward told me more than anything else in the room so far. The independent directors were now paying attention in a different way, not to family history, to credibility and motive. The answer I had given was the only safe one because it was both restrained and obviously reasonable. Marianne had hoped the revelation would make me look concealed. Instead, it made her look territorial. So I kept going. By minute 24, we had reached the second major point. Governance suitability. This was where the room started to tighten. I moved to the next section of the deck. Clean title. Governance conditions under expanded strategic integration. No family names in red. No trapdoor theatrics. Just a structured list of risks that increase when a highly centralized leadership team seeks deeper dependence on outside infrastructure, while internal oversight remains weak or too concentrated in one operating branch. Daniel interrupted before I reached the second bullet. Are you suggesting our governance is inadequate? I let the question sit for half a second. I'm saying it concentrates more risk than VAIR generally accepts when strategic dependency is likely to increase. Bryce leaned forward. Based on what exactly? Based on concentration of sign-off pathways, executive control over reporting narratives, transition exposure, and the absence of sufficient internal independence across key performance representations. His face changed very slightly at that phrase. Reporting narratives, there it was. A reflex, tiny, but visible if you were looking for it. And I was. Leela had been right. Don't rescue anyone from understanding. So I clicked to the next slide. A summary table appeared, not the internal review, not the full concern set Mina and Layla had developed, just enough to justify caution without overreaching. Revenue smoothing anomalies, category volatility inconsistent with leadership summaries, forecast to performance divergence, vendor credit timing patterns requiring enhanced review prior to expanded partnership. The independent director on the far end adjusted his glasses and said, I don't remember seeing this level of variance concern in prior leadership briefings. Bryce answered too quickly, because most of it is transitional and well within expected range. I turned to him. And then you should have no difficulty supporting independent verification. That was the first moment the room truly changed. Not because I had exposed anything, because Bryce had just been given a clean off-ramp and did not take it. He could have said, of course. He could have welcomed the review and repositioned himself as cooperative. Instead, he hesitated, only for a beat. But in governance rooms, a beat is a paragraph. Alan looked from Bryce to me. Independent verification wasn't flagged as a prerequisite in the current discussion set. No, I said. It became one after the deeper dependency modeling was completed. Daniel's jaw set more visibly now. By whom? By me, I said. And by the review standards attached to any structure where VARE could become materially entangled with unresolved reporting exposure. No one spoke for several seconds. The harbor beyond the windows was pale and cold. Somewhere below us, a siren moved through downtown traffic and faded. Someone at the far end of the table turned a page too quickly and then stopped moving altogether. Finally, one of the outside advisors asked, "What kind of exposure are we talking about?" That was the question. The room itself seemed to lean toward it. I folded my hands once on the table and answered with absolute care. At this stage, I'm talking about a level of inconsistency significant enough that VARE would require independent audit confirmation before expanding the partnership under current leadership attestations. Not fraud, not accusation. I'm not personal, just enough truth to move the floor under the people who understood what the sentence really meant. Bryce tried anger next. "This is absurd," he said. "You walk in here after disappearing for years, bury yourself inside some global vendor structure, and suddenly we're supposed to treat your opinion like a regulatory event?" There it was, disappearing. Global vendor structure, opinion, family contempt trying to put on a business tie. I looked at him and said, "Not my opinion, my threshold." Then I turned to Alan. "If you'd like, we can pause here and let your office decide whether these conditions warrant escalation before we proceed with any deeper integration discussion." Alan did not answer immediately. He was doing the math, and not just the business math. Reputational math. Governance math. The math every serious executive has to do when a meeting stops being about upside and starts becoming about what they'll wish was in writing later. Before he could speak, Marianne said very softly, "This seems highly irregular." Lila had predicted that word exactly. I answered without looking at her. "No, it's highly inconvenient." That was the first line I said all morning that carried even a trace of the old wound inside it, and I felt it the second it left my mouth. Not because it was wrong, because it was close to the edge. So I reset. I clicked to the next slide and said, "There are two possible paths." A simple decision page appeared. Path 1. Proceed only under independent governance review, leadership restructuring within the affected division, and phased implementation tied to external oversight. Path 2. Suspend expansion, or maintain only current limited service relationship and initiate full internal reevaluation before re-entering strategic discussion. Nothing melodramatic. No "I own your future now" nonsense. Just structure. One of the independent directors said, "Leadership restructuring, meaning what precisely?" This time I did answer directly. At minimum, removal of current operational sign-off concentration within the logistics modernization arm, new independent reporting supervision, external audit validation before any expanded dependency. Bryce went pale, not dramatically, the kind of pale that drains through the edges first. Daniel's posture changed too. Not collapse, calculation. He knew now, maybe not every detail, but enough. And because he knew, the room finally split along its real lines. The independent directors and outside advisors started reading the packet like people who had just realized a polite meeting might become the first page of something much uglier if handled badly. Alan asked for a 5-minute recess. No one objected. The second the room broke, Daniel stood. "Celeste," he said, "a word." Not a request, a reflex. I stayed seated. "Anything relevant can be said in front of the room?" His face hardened. "Don't do this." There are phrases older men use when they can feel hierarchy failing, but still hope private access might restore it. "Don't do this. Don't make this public. Don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be." I looked up at him. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm declining to protect what should have been examined earlier." That was when Marianne stood too. Her chair moved back with the same neat sound I remembered from years before. She still looked immaculate, but age or stress or both had sharpened the lines around her mouth. "You've wanted this for a long time," she said. I could have answered emotionally. I could have told the room about the support function line, the proposal she wouldn't read, the laughter, the years of being useful in private and diminished in public. Every fact would have been true. None of it would have helped. So I said, what I've wanted for a long time is a room where performance metrics matter more than family habits. Bryce gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You're enjoying this? No, I said. I'm finally in a position where your enjoyment of my exclusion no longer changes the math. That shut him up completely. Across the room, though one of the independent directors was pretending not to hear while absolutely hearing everything. Good. Let him. Alan stepped back in with Vare's general counsel and closed the boardroom door. All right, he said, here's where we are. Based on what's been presented, we're pausing the current expansion discussion and limiting today's meeting to suitability and immediate risk considerations. The word pausing hit the room like a pressure shift. Daniel looked at Alan and said, surely that's premature. The general counsel spoke before Alan could. No, she said, not if reporting exposure tied to leadership at a station may affect integration safety. She was a careful woman, the kind who never wastes a sentence unless she wants it remembered later. And hearing her say that in my family's boardroom felt like watching a language I trusted finally become the language that mattered there too. Bryce tried one last move. This is what happens when you hand strategic influence to people with grudges. I turned to him slowly. If I were operating from a grudge, I said, this meeting would look very different. No one questioned that because everyone in the room knew, suddenly and perhaps for the first time, that I could have approached this with more spectacle and had not. That difference gave me more authority than outrage ever could have. Alan asked if Vare's recommendation was final. I answered, the recommendation is conditional. Current leadership concentration in the affected division is not acceptable under expanded dependency. That can change. Time, but not through reassurance. The independent director to Daniel's left spoke up. Let's stop circling this, he said. Bryce, can you support an independent review of your division's reporting and related transition summaries, yes or no? Bryce looked at Daniel. There it was again. The instinct to find the hierarchy before the truth. Daniel looked back at him, and in that one glance I saw years of family machinery humming underneath polished procedure. Protection, succession, public narrative, denial held together by blood and confidence. Then Daniel said the sentence I had not been sure I would ever hear from him in any form. If that's what's required, yes. Bryce stared at him. It happened so quickly most of the room probably thought they were watching ordinary governance under pressure. I knew better. That was the first real crack. And then not because Daniel had suddenly become ethical, because he had decided the hierarchy might survive Bryce's exposure better than it would survive deeper scrutiny if he resisted too obviously. Families like mine do not betray each other only out of righteousness. Sometimes they do it because the structure demands a sacrifice. I sat very still and let the room absorb what had just happened. Alan looked at me. Would Vare continue under that condition? Under independent review, interim reporting controls, and pending satisfactory findings, I said. Possibly. Bryce pushed back from the table so hard his chair hit the credenza behind him. This is insane. No one answered. That was the cruel beauty of those moments. Once the room stops feeding someone's certainty, their volume becomes self-indicting. Marion looked at him and said, Bah, sit down. He didn't. He looked at me instead. You waited for this. I held his gaze, and no, I said, I built past you. That was the line that ended him. Not legally, not professionally, not yet. But in the room, as the central heir, the inevitable next operator, the man whose confidence was supposed to carry institutional trust, because the name had always done half the work for him. He sat down after that, not because he wanted to, because standing no longer helped. The rest of the meeting moved with the strange clipped precision of rooms that have realized history is happening, but still insist on speaking in professional grammar while it does. Action items, preliminary conditions, audit pathways, governance contingencies, board follow-up, written documentation, limited continuation of current contracts only. Then no expansion until independent review concluded. I answered every question put to me. I did not overreach once. At 11:16, the meeting adjourned. Chairs moved, papers gathered. People avoided eye contact selectively, which is always informative. Alan and General Counsel stepped aside to confer. The independent director spoke in low tones near the window. Marian remained seated, looking at the polished table as if willing the room back into a shape where she was still deciding what counted. Daniel approached me only after most others had shifted into motion. Celeste. I looked up. He seemed older now than he had even that morning, not softened, just older. There is a difference. This didn't have to happen this way, he said. I almost smiled. That sentence. Always that sentence from people who benefit from delay. As if the problem is the form exposure takes and not the years of conditions that made exposure inevitable. I stood and slid my tablet into my bag. Yes, I said, it did. He stared at me a moment longer, perhaps waiting for more. Some speech, some wound, some appeal to family language he could still use to reframe himself. I gave him nothing else, because by then I understood something clearly. The real reversal was not that I had returned with power. It was that I no longer needed him to understand me for the truth to keep moving. I walked out of the boardroom with my materials in hand and the harbor at my back. In the hallway outside, Bryce was standing alone near the glass, one hand braced flat against the window, his reflection doubled over the water below. He turned when he heard the door. For a second, we simply looked at each other. Then he said, "You could have come to me privately." That almost made me laugh. "All those years," I said, "and you still think privacy is where truth goes to become fair?" He flinched. Not visibly enough for anyone else, maybe. Enough for me. I stepped past him toward the elevator. Behind me, he said, "What do you want?" I kept walking. At the call button, I turned once and answered with complete honesty. "A qualified room." Then the elevator opened and I got in, and he was still standing there when the doors closed. But the meeting was only the first collapse. Because once a family empire loses control of the room where its own myth was supposed to protect it, the next thing it loses is sequence. And by the time I got back to the office that afternoon, the first resignation draft was already waiting in my inbox. The first resignation draft hit my inbox at 2:14 p.m. Not Bryce's, not yet. It was from one of Hale and Rowan's outside advisors, a man who had spent the morning looking as if he wanted the boardroom walls to develop a second exit. His note was short, professional, and careful in the way serious people become careful when they realize a situation is no longer merely difficult, but historical. In light of today's developments, I am stepping back from interim advisory involvement pending independent review findings and governance stabilization. Governance stabilization. That phrase told me more than the resignation itself. It meant the outside world had already started translating what happened into institutional language. Not family tension, not a misunderstanding, instability. At 2:26 came the second email. This one was internal to VARE. Alan, copying legal and procurement, formally paused the expansion pathway and requested a written recommendation from my office outlining minimum conditions under which any future partnership discussion could continue. At 2:31, Leela called. "How bad?" I asked. "Good," she said. Only Lila would use that word for the early stages of a collapse. "What moved first?" I asked. "The right things," she said. "External advisors are stepping back faster than the family can reframe. That means confidence broke in the right direction." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the rain sliding down the window beside my desk. "And Bryce?" A short pause. "Not done yet," she said. "But I'd be surprised if he survives the week in his current role." When the call ended, I sat very still for a while and let the room around me come back into focus. The strange thing about waiting years for a moment like that is that when it finally comes, the body doesn't always know what emotion to choose first. There was no rush of triumph, no cinematic closure. Mostly I felt quiet, not empty, not vindicated, just quiet in a way I had not been the day I walked out of that boardroom 6 years earlier, with my proposal under my arm and humiliation in my throat. That younger version of me would have imagined a sharper feeling, a more dramatic justice, maybe even a kind of sweetness. Real justice, when it comes through systems instead of speeches, tastes different. It tastes like paperwork moving without your permission anymore. By 4 p.m., Reed was standing in my office doorway with 2 coffees and the kind of expression he wore when he was trying not to sound pleased too soon. "One for you," he said, setting the cup down. "One for me because I'm not leaving until you say whether the empire actually cracked or just made expensive noises." I took the coffee and said, "It cracked." He nodded, not smiling yet. Good. Then he added, For what it's worth, you were colder than I expected. I looked up. Is that criticism? No, he said. It's admiration with a little fear mixed in. That made me laugh for the first time all day. Mina came in 10 minutes later with a draft action list already structured. Internal VAR memo, external governance threshold summary, escalation protocol if Hale and Rowan challenges review conditions, as dependency continuity options if contracts are narrowed. She set it down and asked, Do you want Bryce's name in the first pass or only role references? Role references, I said. Let the facts pull the name in. Don't push it. She gave a small nod. That was the rhythm of my life now. Not revenge fantasies, documents, teams, thresholds, decisions that needed to survive scrutiny. And that more than anything was the reversal. Not that I got to embarrass them, that I had built a world where they no longer defined the frame. The first direct message from the family came at 5:12 p.m. from Marianne. Celeste, we need to speak privately before this goes any further. I read it once, then again, and set the phone down without answering. At 5:26 came Daniel. This can still be handled with discretion. That word, discretion. Family systems love that word when public consequences arrive. It means let us pull this back into private weather where we still know how to breathe. At 5:41, Bryce called. I let it ring out, then again at 5:44 and again at 5:51. I answered on the fourth call, not because I owed him anything, but because some things are more useful heard directly. His voice was tight and too controlled, like someone holding a door shut with their shoulder. You made your point. No, I said, I made a recommendation. He exhaled sharply. Don't do that. Don't stand there behind Vare and pretend this wasn't personal. I looked down at the legal pad on my desk, at the notes from the meeting written in my own hand. If it were personal, I said, I would have used very different tools. He was silent just long enough to reveal that the sentence had landed. And then he said, What do you actually want from me? There are questions people ask when they mean, What must I surrender to make this stop? That was his, I answered honestly. Nothing private. He made a sound I couldn't quite classify. Of course, he said. You want the room? I already had the room. That silence afterward told me more than anything else he said. When he spoke again, the certainty was gone. This is our family. I looked at the rain-dark glass across the office and remembered my proposal sliding off the boardroom table, remembered Marianne's hand moving it aside like it was clutter, remembered Bryce laughing. No, I said, it's your hierarchy. Then I ended the call. He did not ring back. That evening, I stayed at the office until nearly 8, in finishing the VAR memorandum myself because some documents are too important to delegate fully. It was 4 pages, precise and unadorned. Current recommendation, no expansion of strategic dependency. Conditions for any future reconsideration, independent forensic review, restructuring of operational sign-off authority, interim external governance supervision, and full board acknowledgement of material reporting deficiencies if substantiated. No emotional residue, no family history, just the cost of doing business with a company that had confused inherited confidence with institutional safety for too long. When I finally got home, the apartment was dark, except for the kitchen light I had left on that morning. I kicked off my shoes, set my bag down, and stood there in the silence, with my hand resting on the counter. There was a bottle of white wine in the fridge. I looked at it, left it there, not because I was above celebrating, because I did not want to mark the day that way. Instead, I changed clothes, washed my face, opened the old proposal I had brought with me in the bag, and laid it flat on the kitchen table beside the new VAR memo. 6 years between those two documents, one written by a woman asking for a seat, the other by a woman deciding the terms of access. I sat down and let that image do its work without forcing a bigger conclusion out of it than it deserved. The week after the meeting unfolded exactly the way structural collapses often do. Not in one giant public explosion, in a series of fast, sober decisions by people who suddenly understood which side of the risk they did not want to be standing on. By Monday morning, Hale and Rowan had announced an internal governance review. By Monday afternoon, Bryce had been placed on leave pending external assessment of the logistics modernization arm. By Tuesday, one of the independent directors had requested emergency board authority to suspend any executive attestations tied to the affected division until the review concluded. By Wednesday, Marianne's foundation event appearance was postponed due to scheduling conflicts. That almost made me laugh. Daniel did not resign immediately. Men like him rarely do. They try first to remain useful to the repair process, to act as continuity, to imply that they are now the adults in the room cleaning up something that regrettably got out of hand beneath them. It is one of the oldest executive reflexes in the world. But even his footing shifted. Two lenders asked separate follow up questions about governance continuity. A municipal client requested reassurances in writing. An industry newsletter published a bland little item about leadership review inside a regional infrastructure firm amid modernization concerns. And everyone who mattered read between the lines. By then, Vare's pause had become the center of gravity. That was the real turning point. Not because our company was morally superior, because in sectors like that, once a major strategic partner visibly hesitates, everyone else starts checking their own exits. I heard pieces of it through the normal channels: Lila, Alan, public filings, quiet calls. I never had to chase information. Once truth starts moving in institutions, it leaves a trail in ordinary paperwork. On Thursday evening, Daniel asked to meet. And not through Marianne, not through some assistant. He called directly and left a voicemail that lasted 43 seconds. "Celeste," he said, "this has gone further than I think even you intended. I'd like one conversation. Just us. Just us." As if he could still move the story back into the old family grammar. Uncle and niece, private pain, clarification, dignity. I listened to the message once and then called Lila. She picked up on the second ring. "He wants a meeting," I said. "He wants containment," she corrected. "I know." "Then the answer's no." I leaned against the kitchen counter and looked out at the dark window over the sink, my own reflection faint in the glass. I wasn't planning to say yes. "Good," she said. "You've spent years building a reality larger than their private language. But don't climb back inside it now." So I didn't. I sent one sentence the next morning. Any further discussion should go through formal review channels. That was it. No cruelty, no warmth. Just a locked door with a professional handle. Bryce's fall was uglier. Not because I made it so. Because men who build their authority on managed perception usually fracture badly once the room stops protecting them. He tried defiance first, then denial, then selective blame. He claimed the reporting distortions were timing misunderstandings, then legacy category issues, then an inherited accounting inconsistency amplified by transition pressure. He gave 3 different explanations in under 5 days. Nothing destroys an executive faster than inconsistent confidence under audit conditions. By the end of the second week, the board had accepted his resignation for the benefit of the review process. That phrase was almost tender in how dishonest it was. For the benefit of the review process. As if the process had inconvenienced him into stepping down instead of exposing the shape of what he had built his authority around. Reed sent me the announcement with no message attached. I read it standing in the hallway outside a conference room while people moved past carrying lunch containers and talking about ordinary work. That was another thing I had not expected about the aftermath. It happened inside normal life. Budget still needed reviewing. New hires still had questions. Vendors still missed deadlines. A London team still wanted revised transfer language on a licensing schedule. My own company still existed in motion, the larger than the family story, and requiring me to show up inside it. That grounded me in a way triumph never would have, because the point had never been to live inside their collapse. The point was that my life no longer depended on their version of me surviving. About a month after the meeting, Alan sent over the final VAR position. Expanded strategic partnership with Hale and Rowan was terminated. Existing limited infrastructure relationships would be narrowed and transitioned where commercially reasonable. Future reconsideration, unlikely pending full governance restoration and independently validated recovery, not currently anticipated. I read the memo, signed the transition approvals that applied to my divisions, and moved on to the next file. That may sound cold. It wasn't. It was completion. Marianne wrote once more after that. A long email, carefully composed, the kind of message people write when they want to sound reflective without surrendering too much structure. She acknowledged that mistakes were made in how my early efforts had been received. She said she regretted certain phrasing from years ago. She wrote that the family had failed to appreciate the seriousness of my capabilities. Certain phrasing. I almost admired the discipline of it. I did not answer. Not because I needed her to suffer, because not every late acknowledgement earns access. Daniel never wrote again. A mutual industry contact told Jonas 6 months later that Daniel had shifted into a non executive role and was focused on stewardship and transition. Another elegant way of saying the center of gravity had moved without him. The company itself survived, but smaller. And that part matters. I did not destroy Hale and Rowan. Reality resized it. The logistics modernization arm was broken up and rebuilt under outside supervision. One division was sold. Two long protected executives took early retirement. The family still retained the name on the building for a while, but not the confidence underneath it. In the end, that was more honest than a dramatic ruin would have been. As for me, the next year became the cleanest of my adult life. Not easiest, cleanest. 3 months after Bryce resigned, I closed on a house. Not a mansion over the water, not a glittering reward property chosen to make a point. A quiet, modern house on a steep street in West Seattle, with long windows, pale wood floors, and a small study that looked out toward the sound. The first time I walked through it, the rooms were empty enough to echo. And I remember thinking how much space there was for a life with no audience. The closing was at 11 o'clock on a Friday. I signed the last page, took the keys, and sat in my car afterward for a full 5 minutes, with both hands around the steering wheel, and no music on. I thought about the clearance rack charcoal suit, the old boardroom, the cardboard box I carried out of the tower, the first cramped office over the marine insurance broker, Jonah sleeping on the office sofa with a jacket over his face, Mina color-coding chaos into something useful at 2 in the morning, Reed talking me into taking risks I was smart enough to fear and foolish enough to need. And I thought, not for the first time, that the best part of building your own world is not the moment people who dismissed you are forced to see it. It's the quieter moment after, where when you realize you built it to stand, whether they ever look at it or not. I invited the team over the week after I moved in. Nothing formal. Wine, takeout, music low in the background, boxes still stacked in the hall. Jonah complaining that I had bought too many glasses for a woman who barely hosted. Mina standing in the kitchen explaining why my spice drawer made her uneasy. Reed opening a bottle and saying, "to qualified rooms." That made me laugh. We all knew what he meant. Later that fall, I did one more thing that mattered to me. A former junior analyst from Hale and Rowan named Naomi reached out through LinkedIn. She was bright, underused, and being quietly pushed into support work, despite doing better operational analysis than two men above her. Her message was professional and restrained. But she said she admired the work VAR's systems division was doing and wondered whether I had time for a short career conversation. I did. We met for coffee. She was 26, alert, too careful with her own brilliance in the way women often become when institutions keep teaching them that confidence must stay apologetic to remain employable. Within 20 minutes, I recognized the look in her face whenever she said things like, "I'm probably overthinking it," before describing something she was very obviously understanding more clearly than the people around her. At the end of the conversation, I offered her an interview, not as charity, because she was excellent. She joined us 2 months later, watching her present her first review summary to senior leadership in our office, without being interrupted, without being softened into appropriateness, without anyone asking her to make herself smaller for the comfort of mediocre men, gave me a kind of peace I had not expected. That was when I understood something the old version of me never could have. The opposite of family is not distance. The opposite of family is hierarchy disguised as love. Real loyalty does not require your silence in exchange for belonging. Real respect does not thank you privately and diminish you publicly. And real power, the kind worth having, is not the ability to flip the table. It is the ability to build a better one and decide calmly, lawfully, and without begging who gets invited near it. People still ask me sometimes whether I ever forgave them. I don't think about it that way. But forgiveness is too often treated like a door other people are entitled to knock on once enough time has passed. Time is not accountability. Regret is not repair. And blood, I learned, is one of the weakest business credentials in the world once the numbers stop flattering it. What I feel now is not rage, it's distance. Earned, deliberate, peaceful distance. The old proposal still lives in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, not because I worship the wound, because I like remembering the truth of it. The plan was sound, the room was wrong. Both things can exist at once, and learning that saved me years of carrying shame that never belonged to me. Sometimes on clear evenings, I sit in the study of that house with the windows cracked, the sound drifting up from the water, and I think about what Bryce said the day I resigned. Building a real firm is another. He was right about that at least. It was another. Harder than I expected, slower than I wanted, more expensive, more lonely, more beautiful in the end, and much too real to be taken away by the people who once decided I was only useful if I stayed in the chair they had already chosen for me. If there's any lesson in my story, it's not that revenge is sweet. It's that clarity is stronger than longing, that the room does not have to love you for the numbers to hold, that being underestimated can become a kind of unintentional gift if you survive it long enough to build in peace, and that the day people realize they needed the very mind they tried to reduce is rarely loud at first. Usually it begins with one changed meeting, one paused contract, one silence in the right room. Then the whole structure starts learning your name properly.